Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Cheneal Puljević. I'm from the Centre of Research Excellence on Achieving the Tobacco Endgame at the University of Queensland. Sorry, just one second. So I'm in the School of Public Health, but I did my PhD at the Griffith Criminology Institute, so it is a pleasure to be among criminology colleagues again. I also want to mention my co-authors from my centre, Mustafa Mardani and Carl Gartner, from UNSW, Liz Barrett and Alison Ritter, and from my PhD home, Dominique de Andrade. So today I'm here to speak to you about a recent project which was funded by the AIC, involving qualitative interviews with 50 consumers of illicitly traded tobacco products to explore the factors that drive or deter their use. Now, considering I'm in a room of criminologists, I'm going to add a disclaimer and apology for my use of the word deterrents before the deterrence theory scholars lynch me at lunch. So drivers and deterrents just sounds good, but of course many of the things I'm talking about are not deterrents in the true sense of the term, but they're rather kind of things that can stop people from buying the products. So now you know. So before I begin, let's find the right button. I wanted to quickly mention some of the other projects that I'm involved in, and these are just some of the projects. We have a lot going on in this topic, and others in my team are doing research on this topic as well. So my DECRA fellowship just concluded, and that investigated the consumer side of the market, and that's what I'm going to be speaking to you about today. So I've also got some survey data and some data from street intercept studies that I haven't published yet, and we also have an ARC discovery project starting in July, which will be exciting, looking at monitoring the market via a mystery shopper study, littered pack or cigarette butt studies, scraping of Google Maps data, and scraping of Reddit data. So luckily, Alex has already provided some background in the market, specifically explaining that 50 to 60% of the overall tobacco market now comprises illicitly traded products, and that market really has expanded rapidly over the last few years. So I just wanted to give some more context about product characteristics, where people are getting their products from, and so on. So in terms of product types, there are two overall types of illicit tobacco products. There's cigarette packs and loose leaf tobacco, known locally as chop chop. And the ATO estimates that around 85% of the market is the cigarette packs and 15% chop chop. The imported cigarettes, like this pack of Marlboros on the left, are certainly the most common kind that we're seeing. So this pack of Marlboros was bought by my neighbour for $5 from a local tobacconist in Brisbane. Other common brands of these imported cigarettes include Manchester or Double Happiness. If you're a cigarette packaging nerd like me, and you'll definitely see a lot of Manchester and so on lying on the ground. We've also seen cigarettes in counterfeit packaging, like this middle picture. So this packaging mimics Australian plain packaging with the graphic health warnings, but we know these are illicit, firstly because my friend paid $10 for them, and secondly because we are reasonably confident that Manchester is purely an illicit brand, so only traded illicitly around the world. And the ABC actually published an article about a week ago about these counterfeit products. So here you can even see loose leaf tobacco in counterfeit packaging. And this article explains that Chinese manufacturers are selling these products online via websites like Alibaba for as little as 5 cents per pack. And finally, we have chop chop, which is typically grown domestically in large hidden crops. Chop chop is usually sold in plastic bags, like you can see in the picture, and that can cause mold problems if the tobacco has any moisture in it. So then in terms of where people are sourcing these products from, well, from my surveys and my street intercept studies, the answer is consistently tobacconists being the main source. So across all of those studies, weirdly, it was about 65% was the number we got of consumers buying their products from tobacconists. Then we have around 30% buying them from these convenience stores, like you see in the middle, that also often sell gifts or kids' toys and lollies and things like that. And then finally, there's a small percentage who are buying their products online, so from like cheapsmokes.com.au or getting it via friends and family. And then in terms of the price paid, well, I mentioned that my neighbour gets these for $5, but that is on the cheaper side, and we know from all our surveys and so on that the average price is usually around $10 per pack. I did meet someone who was paying 50 cents a pack, and he wasn't lying, so there are bulk discounts and so on. If my neighbour were to buy Marlboros from Coles, he'd be paying $63. So it's pretty obvious why the illicit packs are popular among consumers. So this is more of an extreme example. You can buy packs of 20 cigarettes for around $40, $50, so 63 is on the higher side. And as I said, $5 is on the lower side. But it's really important to understand this price differential. As a consumer, even if you're a bit uncomfortable about breaking the law, $5 is really appealing. So now on to reasons why this market is of concern. There are a number of reasons, but I'm going to focus on the 5 main ones today. So firstly, it directly undermines the intention of tobacco control policies, such as tax increases or plain packaging. There is strong evidence for the effectiveness of these policies in reducing tobacco use. So of course, their impact is weakened when we have cheap branded products available very easily to get as well. Second, cheap tobacco is now widespread, so people who previously quit smoking because they couldn't afford it have now gone back to smoking. And that is obviously terrible for public health. I think people sometimes forget that tobacco use is still Australia's leading cause of preventable death. It causes more deaths and illness than alcohol and all other illicit drugs combined. It really is so very harmful, and it's available for sale in every supermarket and every petrol station. We also know that many people who were vaping have now switched to tobacco because vapes are harder to get or more expensive, and that is also a policy failure, considering that we know that vaping is much less harmful than tobacco use. Third, the market is largely driven by price, of course, and so people who can't, as I said earlier, who could not afford to smoke have now gone back to smoking. And this is perpetuating tobacco-related harm and financial burden, particularly among financially disadvantaged groups. Fourth, the substantial losses in tax revenue that Alex touched on. So we had a loss of around $4 billion in one financial year. That's probably an underestimate, and that's certainly something to take note of. And then this is where it starts to get really interesting. We know that the market is operated by organized crime syndicates who are capitalizing on the product's high profitability to fund other crimes, such as the arms trade or illicit drug production. A major consequence of the organized crime involvement has been arson attacks on tobacco retailers. So this is a vaping consumer advocacy group called Alive, and they track the fire bombings on their website. So as of a few days ago, 275 fire bombings have occurred in Australia since January 2023. There have been 8 deaths associated with the trade, one of which was an innocent bystander whose house was firebombed. And so essentially, these organized crime syndicates are approaching owners of tobacconists and telling them to earn or burn. Either sell our products to make money for us, or we will set your shop on fire. And then, as you can see in the article on the top left, there's also a lot of rival gang activity where tobacconists are being burnt down because they are operated by rival gangs. All right, so now moving on to consumer research. So research with consumers about what drives their use. There is very, very limited research on this topic, and what has been published is now outdated and shows some contradictory findings. So for example, there are 2 studies saying that price is the main driver of consumers' illicit tobacco use, and then another 2 that say price is not always the main driver. So for example, the study by Aitken et al., it is focus groups, but people were saying that they choose to smoke the chop, the loose leaf tobacco, because it's more natural and therefore healthier. I'm also I'm unaware of any research on what could deter or stop people from buying these products, and so these are the gaps that our research seeks to address. So the aim of this study was to explore the factors that drive Australian consumer purchasing of these products and the factors that could deter the purchasing. So we conducted qualitative interviews with 50 consumers. We recruited them using this poster that you see, which may seem a bit outdated, but it was actually very effective. So anyone who is eligible could register their interest using a QR code. To be eligible, they just had to be an adult who smokes these products at least weekly. And after we assessed their eligibility, they were then eligible for a $50 reciprocity payment. So in other words, just a $50 supermarket voucher to thank them for their time. And then, so we contacted people who were eligible, confirmed they were eligible, and booked in the interview. We did the interviews online. They were transcribed with AI, and then our junior research assistant checked all of them for accuracy. The data were collected between November last year and February this year, so hot off the press. And we're in the process of doing a really in-depth analysis of the data using reflexive thematic analysis. So the findings I'm presenting today are from an exploratory initial analysis. The participants we recruited had a median age of 39.5, 51% male, 46% female, and 3% transgender. And then the majority were from New South Wales or Queensland, despite our best efforts to recruit more people from Victoria and South Australia and elsewhere. For some reason, we just had the most luck in the states where our team were based. All right, so these are the themes that came up in the interview. The first 4 are related to the drivers, so why are people buying these products? And then the last one is the deterrents. So, firstly, widespread accessibility and normalization. As one participant put it, 9 out of 10 tobacconists sell them. One participant reflected that it feels really normalized. Maybe 80% of tobacconists have illegal tobacco at the moment. And another described a line out of the door, 15 people deep in the street of people trying to get in and get cheap darts. And that 9 out of 10 figure is actually probably quite accurate. We have reason to believe that around 85% of the tobacconists across Brisbane were selling these products. So these kind of accounts came up in pretty much every interview, and several also explained that if one shop was out of stock, they could simply just go to another shop nearby. And they also described this behavior as very normal within their social networks, particularly among other people who smoke. Then, of course, price. Participants consistently told us that the main reason they buy it is because it's cheaper. As one participant said, the reason we all smoke illicit cigarettes is for the price. Another said, if I wasn't smoking tobacco, I probably wouldn't be smoking at all. And then one explained that price differential really well. I wouldn't want to pay $20, $30, $40 if I can get them for $8. Here I want to emphasize that the majority of participants emphasized that the size of the price difference wouldn't matter, and they will always keep choosing the cheaper product. So as this one said, whichever one is cheaper, I'll buy it, even if it's only $2 or $3 cheaper. And that's really important to consider in the context of the discussion around tobacco tax decreases, that even if you were to remove tax entirely, that illicit products would still be cheaper and people are still going to choose those instead. Then the third theme, which is related to the one around price, is about strong anti-government sentiment around tobacco taxation and broader cost of living pressures. So as this person said, I was sick of paying for the taxed tobacco, finding it hard to pay for food and petrol. Another said, I get pissed off at the government making so much money. How much money do you need to keep taxing us, supposedly trying to get us to quit? For some participants, this frustration went beyond price and reflected a broader distrust of government. So, as this one said, why bother feeding the government money when it's so corrupt? Get one over on them. And this actually came up in interviews in the UK as well, this feeling of sticking it to the government, a form of personal resistance by buying these products. And another said, excuse my French, it astounded me how much the government was making in excise that only confirmed my thing of, well, fuck them. And then this last participant put it very nicely, the kind of patronizing parochial state that thinks it knows better for people than what people know for themselves has been completely rejected by the Australian population, and it's hilarious. People just don't give a fuck. They're like, oh well, tobacco's cheap and free, we'll keep buying it and we'll keep smoking. These sentiments came up in almost every interview. So now I've kind of lumped all the other drivers together just into one theme just for the purpose of this presentation. So some people are buying the products because they find that they taste better. So this person said the Manchesters are like better quality, they actually taste better. And then another one believed they might be less harmful, which makes me want to weep. I think they're better for you than the government cigarettes. Well, they're cheap, right? So they probably wouldn't have all the shit in them that the other big people, big companies probably put in that. There's a lot of cork and things that burn in the government cigarettes just to keep the smoke going that aren't tobacco. But the Manchester, it's real tobacco. Yeah. Packaging also came up as an important factor. So because most of the illicit products are not in plain packaging, they are visually appealing and colourful, like this pack of Manchesters that I found on the ground. So this one person said, they're so much more pretty than the legal one. The design is really good. It's so colorful. And then here's another depressing one. I like seeing nice packages again and not being overwhelmed with pictures of like cancer. A few people preferred the imported cigarettes because they prefer brands from another country. So this person said, I guess it just reminds me of home. And this person said, I think I sort of went more quickly to the imports because when I was in Europe, I was smoking cigarettes they didn't have in Australia, and that was sort of like, I prefer those ones. There were also social reasons. So one participant described enjoying the social side of smoking and, sharing cigarettes with friends. So they said, it's easier to share because there's this price point attached to it that is like buying a pint for a mate. So because the tobacco is cheaper, they felt like it made that social exchange much easier. All right, now onto the deterrents, or the things that could help people to stop. So this theme involves the amalgamation of responses to two questions. What changes or events would need to occur for you to stop buying illicit tobacco, or what do you think would work to reduce or stop illicit tobacco among other Australians? So the first, unsurprisingly, is that the participants want the price reduced of the legal products. So this person said, reduce the prices of the normal cigarettes that are legal, and another similarly said, if the prices were to go down, there would be way less illicit tobacco use. But it's really important to interpret this carefully. So as I said before, these prices would have to decrease dramatically for many people to make that decision to change. And so, yes, even if the tax were reduced entirely, the illegal tobacco would still be cheaper. All right, so then on to availability. Some participants suggested that if access was more difficult, they would be less likely to buy it. So this person said directly, if it wasn't so available, I wouldn't be smoking pretty much at all. And another reflected that if the black market disappeared entirely, they would probably quit. A few participants in Queensland also described the impacts of the recent 3-month store closures as having some impact on their use. So this person said it was easy to get until 2 or 3 days ago, and the health department has decided to close, like raid all of the tobacconists again, and giving them the 3-month limit until they can open afterwards. So it's going to be 3 months until we can easily find some again. Another deterrent that participants discussed was the availability of better smoking cessation support or alternatives to smoking. So if the goal is to reduce smoking, the focus should not just be on enforcement or price, but also on making quitting all tobacco easier and providing realistic substitutes for cigarettes. So this one person said you could make like nicotine patches or like nicotine quitting services free of cost. And somebody else said some sort of nicotine replacement therapy, I think, is the way to go. And they found that the small inhalers were the best for them. Others emphasize the importance of having a range of alternatives available rather than just relying on traditional cessation approaches. So this person said, I think that having a choice is important. So having multiple options and not all that combustible. So vape, chewing tobaccos, it's important to have everything on offer. And a few participants did raise vaping specifically as a potential substitute for smoking. So one participant summarized this view quite nicely, saying, legalize vaping, that's how you get people to quit cigarettes. Some participants also said that better information or education could make a difference. For example, one said, I guess if I'd found out more about the criminal activity that goes around it, if I was more informed about that it's bad, I might consider quitting, because I don't want to be a part of it in general. I'm not proud of it. So there's actually been some quite successful public education campaigns in the UK, most of those highlighting the criminal aspect around the trade and the harms that it brings into the community. And then a few people suggested that more concrete, quantified information about the health impacts of tobacco could be more persuasive. And a lot of people didn't want to see more of the generic anti-smoking warnings that people are used to seeing. All right, so conclusions. What can we do about this? So in response to the strong role of price that we saw in the findings, I suggest that appropriate responses would be to pause any further tax increases and to use tax revenue to make nicotine replacement therapy free or much cheaper. It just makes sense that the products designed to help people quit smoking should be cheaper than the tobacco itself, especially when tobacco is now widely available for as little as $5 or $10. And then on the topic of tax, reductions. Obviously, this is a very controversial issue, and I don't have time today to give the issue justice. But fortunately, we published a commentary in Tobacco Control just last week that addresses this issue in detail and explains why calls to reduce tobacco taxes underestimate both the complexity of the illicit market and the critical role that high tobacco prices play in reducing smoking behavior. And you can access the article via the QR code. So, as I said, only large tax reductions are likely to make a difference. Removing the tax entirely would possibly not even make that much of a difference, and that would be crazy. That would go against all international evidence on tobacco taxes. It's also worth noting that lowering tobacco taxes is exactly what the tobacco industry wants us to do, and there is extensive evidence that tobacco companies actually contribute to illicit trade. They deliberately divert their products into illicit channels to perpetuate tobacco use. And it's also worth being very critical about the people who are calling for tobacco taxes to be lowered. There was an article in The Guardian a few weeks ago outlining how one person who has been a very loud voice in this debate into reduced tobacco taxes may actually receive tobacco industry funding. So it's very important to be critical when viewing the people who are commenting on this issue. All right, and then this is a finding from one of the street intercept studies that I've conducted. We asked people how much cheaper legal tobacco would need to be in order for them to buy it instead of illicit tobacco. So you can see that the majority, 60%, said it would have to be the same price for them to switch. And then down the bottom, there were a lot of people who said 30% cheaper, or they're unsure, but it needs to be cheaper. There's also a $40 cheaper option, which has disappeared. But what you need to know here is that it's only a minority who is saying that their tobacco use would change if it was only $5 or $10 cheaper. In terms of reducing availability, well, we now have tobacco licensing schemes in every state and territory, which facilitate store closures, fines, and other penalties in order to curb the market. However, these currently vary quite significantly between jurisdictions. There have been reforms to try and strengthen some of these, but there are some states like Victoria, for example, they only began their enforcement action last month. And there was a news report that said they only have 14 enforcement officers for the whole state versus Queensland that has about 200. And I know that some people are skeptical about whether enforcement can actually make a difference, but Queensland provides a really good case study of how it can. So there was a 10-day blitz in November, December, where they shut down, it was actually closer to 160 stores for 3 months. And we saw quotes earlier from consumers who said that this was making a difference for them. So from anecdotal reports around me, my neighbor, people online and so on, it's much harder to get these products now that so many of the shops have been shut down. Queensland Health told us that the calls to quit line actually doubled in the week following the blitz. So potentially this is having an impact. Some of the stores that were shut down for 3 months are beginning to reopen. So my local store reopened on Wednesday last week, and it was shut down again on Sunday. So the enforcement is making a difference. And then, as was reflected in our findings, people are asking for more public education about the harms of tobacco use and sources of quit support. There have been a lot of anti-vaping campaigns in the last few years, not many anti-smoking campaigns. So it's really, we desperately need to remind people, especially the younger generation who weren't exposed to those anti-tobacco ads of the 80s and 90s. It's really important to remind people just how harmful tobacco is. And as I said earlier, there's an need for increased and subsidized quitting support. Only 6.4% of tobacco excise revenue is allocated to tobacco control. So there's certainly a strong argument here for using some of that revenue to subsidize quit support like nicotine replacement therapy. I just want to finally mention that there is a protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products published by the World Health Organization. This is an international treaty that aims to reduce illicit tobacco by strengthening international supply chain control and international cooperation. And the heart of the protocol is a track and trace system, which essentially involves putting a unique marking on each tobacco pack, like a barcode or a QR code, that enables you to track the product through the supply chain to try and work out at which point it exited the legal supply chain and entered the illicit market. Despite our illicit tobacco market being the way it is, Australia is not a signatory to this protocol and I believe has no intention of implementing a system like this. All right, that's all from me. Thank you very much.